I want to thank everybody for joining us for today's session entitled Boost Efficiency and Quality with CSA and Modern Software Tools. Today's session is sponsored by Astrix and presented by ValGenesis. We go to the next slide, please. Before we get into the meat of the presentation, I just do want to take a brief moment and introduce Astrix. We are the sponsor of today's session. Astrix is a professional consulting firm and services firm that works exclusively in life sciences. We are very much a science-based company ourselves, in that 90% of our employees, well over 400 of them, hold advanced scientific degrees. We bring a very unique blend of services, both strategic and technical, to customers to help them do everything from a selection of technologies to, to implement and manage their R&D activities, to very high-level strategic. How do we get you to the cloud? How do we, look at implementing things like artificial intelligence, things along those lines. And we've been doing this for the better part of 28 years. So we're very excited to be with our partner today, ValGenesis. And we can go to the next slide, please. And I'm going to introduce our speaker, and then I'm going to sit back and enjoy the presentation with everybody else. So Emmanuel Cansino is joining us as the Senior Director of Industry Solutions for ValGenesis. He brings with us over 20 years of experience involved in many areas of the company, from product development to project management and support. And he currently leads the solution engineering team. So Emmanuel, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you from here, and I'll be back on at the end to help with questions. I want to unmute Emmanuel.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I do have a tendency to speak when I'm off mute, so I actually did say a bunch of things. But yeah, thank you again for everyone for attending. Before we get into the heart of the presentation, I just want to briefly talk about who we are, ValGenesis, and then talk about, of course, what we're going to be doing today. So within ValGenesis, our mission is really simple. It's to empower life science companies so that they're able to deliver consistent and safe products. This is why we get up in the morning, and this is why we're talking today. We are the pioneers and leaders of digital validation. Just a few numbers that I think are really important. The first is that we were the first to the market with a digitized validation platform, and this started in 2005. Because we were first in the market, we were able to gain market share, and currently we have 30 of the top 50 life science companies as customers. These companies are large pharma, biotech companies, names you'd be familiar with: Bayer, Roche, Otsuka, GSK, Philips, and hundreds of more. We are implemented in over 450 sites. Actually, this is a little bit outdated. It's actually closer to 490 sites that we're now implemented in. And we've had almost 20 years of consistent growth. All right, so in today's webinar, we're going to be focusing on how we're able to boost validation efficiency and velocity by leveraging CSA. And then as well, we're going to talk a little bit about how you can leverage a tool or technology in order to enable this. And the tool we're going to be talking about is our ValGenesis VLMS platform. But really, the initial parts of this is really to understand why CSA is really important and how it's going to be a strategy we will be able to leverage in order to be much more efficient with our validation processes. Before we get into that, just a little brief history about what happened. And I imagine those of you who have been in the industry as long as I have can relate to a lot of these things. In the early years, the 80s and 90s, that's when computer systems really become much more prominent within the regulated space. So more regulations around how computer systems would be used were developed. But for the most part, in terms of validation, it was a very manual process. We may have been authoring using WordPerfect, and I'm dating myself by talking about WordPerfect or Word, Microsoft Word, but everything was really wet signature. And at the time, that really suited our needs because the amount of computer system validation was limited, even though the usage of computer systems did begin to emerge. So in the 1990s and 2000s, again, we were continuing to evolve our usage of computer systems in our industry. There were more standards built, such as GAMP5. We all became familiar with these standards. They helped us with defining our validation process, but the process was really a very, very manual process. There were some tools that we could use for testing, but still in the 1990s and early 2000s, there really wasn't a comprehensive validation solution that existed. Now in the 2000s, in 2005, in fact, that's where software began to emerge, to be used for validating software. And in 2005, ValGenesis launched VLMS, which is our flagship product. VLMS revolutionized how validation was handled because it was the first solution that gave you a true paper to glass transformation. So no longer were you relying upon wet signatures or routing paper through a very manual process, storing documents in an archive such as Iron Mountain. All of that went away with the adoption of ValGenesis amongst our clients. So we truly moved away from paper. Now, the evolution of paper to glass was only the first step in the evolution overall of ValGenesis. And with the emergence of new guidance such as CSA and the requirements for data integrity, our system has also evolved significantly. So now we have built a solution so it is aligned with CSA in mind, and data integrity has always been built into the product, but we do really align with Alcoa++ principles. So I really wanted us to understand the evolution of validation, because in each of these, we were always faced with different obstacles. In the 90s and 2000s, GAMP came around. 2010s, our validation efforts really became much more cumbersome. So we needed a solution that was going to help us do these things, where it was a transition from paper to glass. VLMS came out with a solution to help us with that. The FDA also released the risk-based approach in the case for quality to really help us with streamlining how we do our validation efforts to ensure that we're validating to the right amount. Unfortunately, I don't think we did a really great job as an industry or in validation applying that risk-based approach. We are very risk averse, and as a result, I think we still were over validating. And I think that is when CSA was born, because we were still being challenged with exhaustive amounts of documentation required. So when the FDA released its draft guidance on CSA, this gave us another opportunity to overcome an obstacle, which is the amount of validation that's necessary. So CSA really allows us to streamline that process, and that's what I'm going to be talking about through the presentation, just how CSA is one of the things that's going to really help us evolve our validation efforts. And that, alongside with a modern technology tool such as VLMS, you're going to be able to reap significant benefits. So why was CSA born? Well, in the previous slide, we talked about some of the different challenges or obstacles that we faced in validation and the different solutions that came about as a result to overcome them. Either they were regulations or guidance passed on by the FDA or EMEA or whomever it may have been. And then it was also technology solutions that helped us realize some of those changes in how validation was to be done. But really, why is CSA so important today? Well, the first reason is that there is a lot of complexity. One thing you've kind of heard me allude to is that as time has evolved, we've become more and more reliant or have used computer technology in both pharmaceutical and med device. There's a lot more integrations that occur amongst computer systems. There's just a lot more complexity overall to the landscape, our quality landscape. And as a result of this, the burden to validate these different tools, including all of the integrations and how the data is passed to one another, has also become much more complex. So we've been drowning in documentation, trying to keep up with the growth of and emergence of computer systems. Now, just even think about something like AI. AI, since when we started talking about ChatGPT, it's really taken over the market. How do we validate that? Well, using traditional validation methods, that's going to be a challenge. Whereas if you use the CSA approach, I think it is going to be feasible, because the CSA approach, which you'll hear me talk about later, just allows us to use our creative minds to attest much more effectively. Another reason why CSA was born was the changes in our software development life cycles and how we were managing releases of our software. So traditionally, we're focused on that kind of waterfall approach. where there are big releases with lots of requirements. You have major releases. That changed with the adoption of an agile methodology, which focuses more on smaller sprints. So fewer amounts of requirements or functionality is released at a time, but you have many more releases. This iterative approach to development allows us to, as the validation, be involved very early on with the release cycle. So we are able to test per release rather than waiting at the end for a final big release to be given. So really it allows us to be involved to find issues early on as part of the, our validation effort. Another reason I think that CSA has come about, or the the draft guidance given about CSA, is because we really didn't understand, and we struggled with a risk understanding. We didn't know how to effectively adopt the risk-based approach to streamline our validation efforts. In our current CSV processes, we also have the challenges of the focus on documentation. I think everyone that's in this room that's done validation has fallen victim to the idea that if it's documented, then it's done. So we focus on just documenting testing rather than really focusing on the quality of testing. We're just making sure that we follow step-by-step prescriptive steps to say that something has been done. It stifles our creativity, as I mentioned before. And really, at the end of the day, does it really mean that we've tested the solution? I think it means that we've tested the solution based on our initial ideas of what the solution should do and how you can do it. Whereas in a CSA approach, you can use your creative mind through things such as unscripted testing that allow you to test freely without having to follow prescriptive steps, which I think is the natural tendency whenever you are testing. If many of you, I imagine, have taken some courses on coding, and when you are testing your code, your first Hello World app, what you did to test it was you didn't have a robust scripted testing. You just, tested it freely, which was unscripted testing. And only when you had a failure would you start debugging and so on. And that's the kind of flexibility that now CSA does provide for us. And then lastly, CSA really became important because CSV is just too comprehensive. It just cannot keep up with modern demands, especially with all of the integrations that are necessary. With the evolution of the new technologies such as AI capabilities changing constantly, we're not going to be able to manage the validation as well as we can using a newer approach, which is much more streamlined, focused on risk, and allowing us to test with our much more freely, which is available in CSA. So in a CSA draft guidance, and this comes me to something, you guys all know this, that critical thinking is one of the key elements to a CSA approach. But in my opinion, critical thinking isn't just when you're in validation, it's actually something that should be thought of as part of the entire life cycle. So yes, when we bring in a new system into our landscape, we use critical thinking skills to determine whether or not validation is required. And if validation is required, we then use critical thinking skills to determine how much documentation would be needed. Like, do we need to follow like the full gamut of testing, IQ, OQ, or URS, FS, DS, IQ, OQ, PQ? Or is it possible for us to manage with a smaller subset of that documentation, of course, based on how we assess risk? When considering what kind of tests will be required following a CSA approach, we are leveraging those critical thinking skills to conduct those risk assessments. And then we use the risk assessment to identify and mitigate any or all of the potential risks to both patient safety and product quality. That's really what we're here for. So with these skills, we're going to be able to truly complete a comprehensive risk assessment and prioritize mitigation efforts and implement the appropriate controls to ensure that all of those risks are mitigated effectively. So when they included CSA as part of draft guidance, I believe that aside from thinking within the process, critical thinking is also important when we start defining our CSA approach. How we are going to adopt the CSA approach, I think we need to think about having flexibility and not being so rigid. For example, if you come to a risk assessment that is high risk, it doesn't mean that you always need to do robust scripted testing. You can also do some unscripted testing, because unscripted testing, again, in my opinion, is a superior way to test, because you're using your creative mind to really test edge and boundary scenarios. All right, so the next important thing that is part of CSA is risk assessment. And of course, risk assessment, our key, or what we're really focusing in on, is patient safety and patient safety and product quality. With a risk assessment approach, you should be able to apply any risk-based approach, be it an FMEA, whatever risk-based approach you're using, and then based on assessed risk, the system should determine a few things. Should be able to determine the amount of testing that's necessary, what kinds of testing you're going to be able to do, and then as well what your validation effort would look like. So being able to assess risk will allow us to drive down testing, and then ultimately what our validation output would be. Risk assessments are really important. They allow us to identify any of those potential hazards that can be associated with any of the software that we're validating. So things such as malfunctions or other errors that can potentially harm patients, they can be found earlier on. We can assess risk, determine the amount of testing, and how rigid or how rigorous the testing must be. By having that ability to evaluate these risks, we can implement different measures that mitigate them, and then of course enhance our patient safety. So risk assessment within a CSA is really important from a QA perspective, because effective risk assessment processes will ensure that we are able to identify quality issues really early on. So as we're part of the development cycle, remember, if you're following a CSA approach, if you follow iterative development, as part of validation, you can identify issues. You're able to inform those issues back to your vendors or even your internal employees, so that those things can be resolved before you get on to a major release. So you're uncovering things early on in this, and before they will have larger impact later on down the road once you go live. So this is some of the importance of assessing risk very early on and defining what your mitigation strategies would be. All right. So as I mentioned, risk assessments are important, again, to drive decision making. Not only does it allow us to prioritize our mitigation strategies and mitigation risks early on, but again, it also drives how much testing would be needed. So based on our assessed risks, we can determine if we, not only what tests, but the amount of objective evidence that would be needed. For example, if you have something that's high risk, maybe you need to ensure that a screenshot is taken, or something that's low risk, maybe screenshots aren't mandatory. So you can make those decisions as well. Not only the kinds of tests to be done, but also the type of validation that's needed, and then from a test by test basis, the amount of objective evidence that would be required. All right, another important component, and this is really something that I am very passionate about, and that is the idea of unscripted testing. Unscripted testing, in my opinion, is really important CSA draft guidance, because it allows for real world simulation. We're able to test freely using real world usage scenarios, and we're going to be able to uncover things that you wouldn't necessarily be able to capture with scripted testing. You can uncover unexpected interactions, like things that you wouldn't have thought you would do, but you end up doing. For example, your test may say, go here, go there, but as you're testing the system, you see there's other methods to get there, and you may test those different methods much more freely because you're not bound by a set of criteria or steps to follow. So it allows you to see more than just what's in front of you, explore outside edge cases. By using those unscripted testing, you also have enhanced test coverage, and the reason being is we're not bound again by scripts. We're able to use our creative minds to think freely, to explore and test as we see fit, like as though we are using the system. Really, that's what validation is about, right? To test how we're going to use the system. Unfortunately, unscripted or scripted testing sometimes loses sight of that fact. Sometimes we're just writing tests to show that it's been tested, not to test whether or not it's performing as we'd expect. And outside of that, we can't our scripted tests do not give us the flexibility to go outside of what we would normally have. If we are in the scripted world and we're in the midst of testing and say we're executing our PQ and realize, hey, we forgot to test this whole function, what do we do? In this case, we have to go back, we have to create an addendum to our test. We have to go through a pre-execution approval to approve that those tests should work. Once approved, then we can go ahead and complete that testing. Once that testing's done, then we have to approve that addendum that was executed and then tie it back to the initial execution. That's a lot of work just to go through something realizing, hey, I forgot to test the timestamp. And whereas with the unscripted testing, you can write a very simple test. I am testing the timestamp, and then you can capture what happens. It passed, it failed. Now, when it comes to unscripted testing, it also allows us to validate some assumptions that we have about the products. We're able to really test whether or not the system will work as we're expecting it to. And it's really part of a user-centric evaluation of a system. So all of the things like UI, UX, usability, those types of issues that you wouldn't necessarily realize in scripted testing become clearly evident when you are running unscripted testing. So this helps us as well with our best practices, how we are planning on leveraging the tool. So defining our guidelines, or if you do create SOPs, which I don't know if you do, but how to leverage that system the most effective manner. And these are the things that unscripted testing does provide us. Now, even though I'm a really huge advocate of unscripted testing, this doesn't necessarily mean that we're not documenting anything. And that's a big misconception about what unscripted testing is. Unscripted testing does not mean you do not document anything. It just means the rigor or amount of documentation is lessened. You don't have to provide a step-by-step set of instructions to get to a specific path. So something that may take me, say, 10 steps to test out a timestamp, I can just right now with unscripted testing, I am testing out the timestamp at this particular screen and do it in one line item. So I would document what I tested, the results, and I don't even have to necessarily capture objective evidence. The only time that objective evidence would really be important in this case is if we had a failure, because we want to be able to uncover that failure and then share that back with development so that they can resolve it quickly, once again, accelerating the release cycle, and then of course, improving the overall quality of the system that we do release. So as I mentioned, I'm just gonna go over again, the unscripted testing, it allows us to uncover any hidden issues. It gives us the ability to evaluate software performance. So we don't, when we write scripted testing, really set metrics on how fast things should appear, how things should pop off. But with unscripted testing, we can realize that we're able to recognize how long things take. We're able to improve our test coverage, going in and out of different scenarios, not being bound by a rigid guideline, really having that flexibility to explore. And then we're able to validate away any assumptions that we may have. And ultimately, this will enhance the user experience. And then, of course, it'll still allow us to abide by regulatory compliance. Unscripted testing is something that is talked about in CSA draft guidance, and one thing that I think is going to really move the needle for all of us in terms of being much more efficient with our validation efforts. Now, another, and the last component I'm going to really talk about here, we've covered 3 of them, which was critical thinking, risk assessment, and unscripted testing. Another thing that I think is really important for CSA to be effective is trust, and trust needs to extend across 3 different areas: to our vendors. And what I mean by this is, if you've read the guidance, the draft guidance on CSA, they talked about being able to leverage, some of what vendors do. And I think if we trust that the vendors are trust in the documentation that they provide, trust that they have done adequate testing, we're going to be able to leverage their documentation as part of our validation packages. Now, I know many of you do that already today, but sometimes it may be a little bit of a challenge. Like, how can you trust someone? How do you start trust a vendor that you just began with? Well, if it's a new vendor to you, you can look at their supplier assessment. You can read through their testing and then gauge based on that supplier assessment, as well as get based on some of the scripts that you've seen, whether or not you can trust them. So this is something that still, it's really up to you to make those decisions, but I think it is important that we trust first, as opposed to always considering them as not there to help us. Our vendors really want us to ensure that we're getting live quickly, and we can trust that they know their software in and out and they've tested it adequately. Now, when it comes to PQs, of course, this is where I say use your unscripted testing, use your creative minds, use your critical thinking, and then continue to test based on how you see the system going to how it will be used. There's also a need to trust our internal employees. We need to trust that they understand what our CSA process is. We need to trust that they are following the process as per our SOPs. And then lastly, we also need to trust our quality department. That quality has bought into the concept of CSA, that they're not going to challenge us on unscripted testing, that they understand what we're doing, how we assess risk, and this is all very prescriptive to them and defined in something such as a CSA playbook. Now, a CSA playbook is something that you can create. It should consist of a high-level understanding of what your SOPs are. And as I mentioned earlier, when you create your SOPs, use your critical thinking skills. Do not write everything to be super prescriptive, because if you do that, you are going to be painting yourself in a box. But put all of the key elements from those SOPs into a CSA playbook that can easily be followed by internal employees, and quality. So quality won't be challenging us on everything. A CSA playbook is really important, not only choosing the right tools, but also having a playbook or an idea of how you're going to be adopting a CSA approach is really going to be important as you evolve your validation processes to align with CSA and using modern software tools. Now, before I just talk, I'm going to talk very quickly, and I'm running short of time here. I'm just going to talk very quickly about an ROI study. So as I said, VLMS was first came to the market in 2005. We actually have run ROI studies with many of our clients. And what we've found from these ROI studies, and these are all done post go live, is that on average, it takes about 39 days to complete a document. This is from when we initiate the document through reviews, approvals, through executions, until you finally put it into the package bundle, which it'll differ, of course, if there's an execution side or if there's requirements, but on average, it was 39 days. On average, our customers had said that it approximately costs about $2,000, just over $2,200 per document. And this was before, we started to use VLMS. This is just kind of the process it took. But once ValGenesis was implemented, they were able to achieve a 50% reduction in validation efforts. So what this meant to them is that they were able to reduce the amount of time it took to complete a document. And of course, because of this, the average cost of the document went down. But more so than how long that cycle time was or the average cost of the document, by reducing their validation effort by 50%, they were able to get products to market quicker. So we actually did some research, and we came across a McKinsey study which said that it takes approximately 20 to 30% of any project is spent in validation. So you can imagine, if you are able to reduce validation effort by 50%, then you're able to reduce that portion of the project by 10 to 15%, meaning you can get your products to market 10 to 15% faster. This means that you're able to start to reap back some of those benefits of getting your product to market. Your patents will last longer and so on, because you're going to be gaining that money 10 to 15% faster than you would following traditional validation approaches. Now, I know I am about near the end of my slide, but I just want to go through one more thing, and that is just talking about extrapolating some value from CSA. So with CSA, although we haven't had the opportunity to do a comprehensive ROI study with our clients, we don't have a lot of clients that are currently in CSA. And I think there are a couple of reasons why people have yet to adopt the CSA. First off, I think that people are afraid of adopting a CSA approach because of fear. Fear of that it's not documented, it's not done. Fear that it's still in, I'm using air quotes here, that it's in draft, it's not official guidance. So there's a fear to take the plunge, and I understand that. In validation, we are risk averse. We abide by quality rules, and we want to ensure that whatever we produce is aligned with regulatory expectations. So that is one reason why I believe that CSA has yet to be adopted. Another reason why CSA hasn't been adopted fully is up until the release of ValGenesis 4.2 and Design Manager, there weren't really any tools available that allowed you to truly adopt a CSA approach. And having a tool that is aligned with what is prescribed in CSA is going to be really important. So the value that you get out of CSA, critical thinking, risk assessment, unscripted testing, and trust. But let me just quickly show you, when you look at realizing value, I'm going to get to it. So let me just get to this part here. So with the realizing tool, you need to leverage the right type of tool, a tool that's going to align with your SOPs. With our design manager, you can build out the design manager to align with how you define SOPs, where it would allow you to enforce your processes and procedures using technical controls. By using the design manager, you'll see significant improvements in efficiency and then of quality. And the reason I say quality is going to be improved because we have a lot more emphasis on unscripted testing, give us that flexibility and creativity to test freely and aligned with the user experience. With a solution, you need something that is data-driven from the outset. This is exactly how we've designed it within our design manager. With this tool, every requirement, every test you build is saved as an object. This is important because you're able to build your testing even before your requirements are fully approved. You can assess risk before a document is done. So I can, for example, look at one of these requirements, URS 1.4.1, and I can go through a risk assessment process. I can build all of my testing necessary for this requirement even before our validation documents are completed. So we're allowing ourselves to test ahead of the time, even before that final signatures or final approvals are done. Gives us a lot more flexibility in how we manage our data. With a CSA approach, you also want to make sure that you're doing right size validation every time. And we're able to do this using your own logic. You can build in your own system logic that allow us to determine the right amount of testing to be done every time. Our clients that use this have noticed significant improvement in how they right size their validation. No longer is everything treated with the same type of scrutiny, where we're following the full IQ, OQ, PQ, URS, FSDS path, dependent upon the GAMP categorization, dependent upon the risk that we've assessed. There's going to be different levels of testing that can be defined. And this is all based on your own logic that you may have. These system assessments ensure that we have consistent outcomes and ensure that there is consistency across the board, regardless of who is creating or assessing a new system. Just based on responses given, the system will automatically tell us what we do and do not need to include. Another benefit of leveraging a system assessment process is, based on our assessed risk, the system will tell us what we need to do. It'll also tell us whether or not the system's been validated. So you get real-time validation status, which really is helpful in an audit. Defining requirements that are object-based, again, really important to a CSA approach because it allows you to assess risk, to even conduct testing prior to the approval of the entire document. So individual URSs can be improved before the URS document is approved. This allows for a lot more collaboration and much more quality testing that can be done for each of those different requirements in real time. It's also important to have a dynamic trace matrix that will link everything together, and we do that within our design manager. We're able to link those requirements to the tests, and as I mentioned, requirements don't have to be approved within a URS document. We can do the risk assessment on an individual case-by-case basis and then build our testing accordingly. So in this example here, our URS is being tested here in some different tests. We have 2 different test sets that are being completed as a result of those URSs. So being able to view our risk as well as the test results and risk assessments in one view, something that we're able to provide you within ValGenesis VLMS 5.0 in our design manager. And then we allow you to use robust scripted testing, which isn't, this is kind of what you're accustomed to, but then as well, it allows us to do unscripted testing with objective evidence. In this example here, we can add screenshots, add video files, any type of objective evidence that's necessary can be added very easily, and it will be rendered as part of the final document in real time. So thank you very much. I'm sorry, I meant to go to that last slide. And there you go. So thank you very much. So generally, with our system, you are going to see that CSA, in my opinion, is the way to go in the future. It's going to allow us to evolve with the demands of what we have today in our modern or our current eco landscapes, our quality landscapes. And by leveraging a tool like ValGenesis VLMS, you're going to ensure that you're able to abide by those principles and leverage what has been described in the CSA guidance, draft guidance. So thank you. I guess it's open to questions.
Yeah, we'll do a couple of things here real quick. I want to go ahead and get the recording stopped.